Hello and welcome everyone watching at home and to the amazing people with us here tonight at the Húsavík Whale Museum. A museum dedicated to whales, their habitat and the relationship we share through history. My name is Eva Björk Káradóttir and I am the museum's director. Tonight is the first of two events in our annual Whale Congress. This is the 6th year we join together to celebrate our passion, knowledge and the latest discoveries in the field of marine biology. Tomorrow night we listen to 6 speakers in the field of whale research and learn about their latest findings. You can find a link to the event in the comment section below. Tonight we have the pleasure of speaking with Mark Carwardine, who is with us live from the UK. After the talk, we will have a Q&A with Mark. So if you have any questions, please leave them in the comment section below. Mark is a zoologist, writer, radio and TV presenter, a wildlife photographer, an active conservationist, and the list goes on. He has written more than 50 books on wildlife and conservation, including many books about whales. He has been studying, observing and photographing whales, dolphins and porpoises around the world for more than 30 years. Tonight he will be talking about his latest books, Handbook of Whales, Dolphins and Porpoises, to warn all of you not to follow in his footsteps. Please welcome Mark Carwardine.
Hello, thanks very much Eva, and thanks to everyone for tuning in this evening. I have to say I'm a huge fan of the Húsavík Whale Museum. I was there when the whole idea first came about, and it's been great to see it evolve into this world-class museum over the years. So it's a real pleasure to be here. I've actually been very fortunate in watching whales, dolphins and porpoises in Iceland many times over actually several decades, I think it is. I was involved in organising Iceland's very first commercial whale watching trip, which took place in Hupp, down in the southeast in, I think it was 1991. Through Discover the World, 3 friends, that was me and Clive Stacey and Ásbjörn Björgvinsson, we chartered a 135-ton lobster fishing boat that you can see here. And we chartered it for a week to take a group of very adventurous whale watchers from the UK to see whales off that spectacular coast. Now, I remember at the time most people in Iceland thought we were completely mad and we were ridiculed in the press and all sorts of things. And I have to say, with hindsight, it actually wasn't the best place in the country to start whale watching. But it did spark an idea, and it led to a whale watching workshop and all sorts of other things. And now, of course, Iceland is a world leader. It's one of the most popular whale watching destinations on the planet. And it really has become a world leader in things like whale research from whale watching boats and eco-friendly whale watching and so on. These are white-beaked dolphins off the Snæfellsnes Peninsula, one of my best encounters with white-beaked dolphins anywhere. And this is a humpback whale within sight and sound of Húsavík. Not quite the whale centre, I think, but it was in Skjálfandi Bay. That was taken from a Cessna with the door removed, just looking straight down on the whale. Fantastic fun. So to the field guide, which is what I'm going to be talking about tonight. Well, ranting. I've got to get it all off my chest, so thank you very much for listening. It's something that's dominated my life for, I would say, the best part of 6 years. And I got really carried away with the whole project. It was supposed to be a very simple field guide, but I actually wrote so much information, and the artist did so much artwork that in the end we decided to make it into 2 books. So there's a handbook with some, 300,000 words and everything you could possibly know about every species and every parasite, anything else you can think of. And a much smaller, more concise, pocket-friendly field guide to go with it. So the handbook was published last year, and the field guide is going to be out very soon. And what's interesting, even in that short gap, as I'll explain during the course of the lecture, a lot has changed. We've actually discovered new species in the gap between the publication last year and the new field guide. Now, all naturalists use field guides, of course, and we tend to take them for granted. I do it myself. We don't think too much about what's involved in putting them together. Most people can't imagine lying in bed at night, which is what I've done for years, worrying about whether a particular species should be described as common, for example, or fairly common, or whether we should say it's bluish grey or greyish blue, and there really is a big difference between the two, or whether its distribution, should include this particular peninsula or that particular stretch of coast. But when you're putting a field guide together, these things really do matter an awful lot. And I spent many, many nights lying awake worrying about it all. So I really feel the pain when I hear comments from people using field guides. Like, they might be saying, look, this field guide says you don't get yellow-bellied, sap-sucking, ruby-throated, bow-legged, moustached warblers on this peninsula, but I'm looking at one right now. And I feel so sorry for the writer of that particular guide. So how do you go about writing a field guide? Well, I wrote a fairly simple guide to cetaceans, to whales, dolphins and porpoises, 25 years ago or so. This was published in, I think it was 1995, might have been a few years earlier than that. And I have to say, sadly, I never learnt that lesson, even back then, never, ever, ever write a field guide. I'm still doing it. But that particular one did fill a niche at the time. But it was in the very early days of whale research, and our knowledge at that time was pitifully small. We've learnt so much more in those intervening years. So much has changed that the guide very quickly became seriously out of date. I was at a whale conference not long ago, and even then somebody put it brilliantly. He said, our knowledge of whales, dolphins and porpoises has increased from nothing to just a little bit. And it sort of sums it up really well. And in fact, when the guide was published in the 1990s, there were only 76 known species of cetaceans. And the one I'm just finishing now, the field guide, that includes no fewer than 92 species. So that alone demonstrates how much our knowledge has improved. And that's partly because we've genuinely discovered a few new species, and partly because we've split other species based on genetic research, of course. So here's just a few examples. These are spreads from that old guide. Remember, they're more than a century old. In 1998, for example, the minke whale was split into the common minke whale and the Antarctic minke whale, became two species. And there was just one species of common dolphin. Then soon after the guide was published, there were two. That common dolphin was split into the long-beaked common dolphin and the short-beaked common dolphin. And now, since I think it's about 2016 or so, there's just one species again. It's very complicated because over the years, over the centuries, more than 20 different species of common dolphin have been described. Now, of course, as I say, just the one, but that could change in the future. I don't know. There are also two species of river dolphin in Asia, the Indus river dolphin and the Ganges river dolphin. There's also the Yangtze river dolphin, of course. But those two species were then combined to make one, the South Asian river dolphin. And then just a couple of months ago, literally, it was split again back into the original two. So now it's back to Indus river dolphin and Ganges river dolphin. And there was even a whale then that was known as the unidentified beaked whale, which is a fantastic name. Or more scientifically, it's known as Mesoplodon A. And this is the artwork. If you have a look, this is the artwork down there, which was a guess, really. We had very, very little information to go on. We just had a few dead specimens and so on. And we tried to piece together what it might have looked like. So try and memorize that artwork, and I'll show you a little later on what it really looks like now that we know that much more. And of course, it's not just new species and splitting species. We've learned so much more about behaviour and ecology and everything else. In fact, I'd go so far as to say that most of what we know now has been learnt since that first field guide was published. So, you won't be surprised to hear that I'm so embarrassed by that book. It's so out of date that if I find it in a bookshop, I actually hide it in the cookery section and hope that no one's going to find it. Turn it back to front as well. So anyway, a new field guide was desperately needed, and I duly signed a contract with my publisher, Bloomsbury, to write it. And that's the fun bit. You come up with the idea, you talk about it, what it might look like, everyone gets all very excited. Then, of course, you've got to go away and do it. That's the bit I forget about. But this is the gist of the contract. I don't know if you can read that if it's too small on your screen. But let me just read it here to help you. It says, I promise to spend the next 5 years, actually it was 6, working 7 days a week, 20 hours a day on a whale, dolphin and porpoise field guide, giving up all my free time without taking holidays, allowing 1 hour to eat lunch on Christmas Day without complaining in any way. I've already broken the contract there by complaining in every way. And I missed the original deadline. The original deadline was 1 year. It took me 6 years, so I was 5 years late in the end. It actually reminds me, I learned how to be late writing books, how to miss deadlines. I did a book years ago called Last Chance to See, with Douglas Adams of the Hitchhiker's Guide to the Galaxy fame. And he taught me brilliantly about missing deadlines. He has a fantastic quote. So I love deadlines. I love the whooshing sound as they fly by. And I've missed book deadlines ever since. Of course, if you're writing a book of this scale, this kind, it's quite an involved book to write. The trick is to put off the actual writing for as long as you possibly can. So first of all, we started working on the cover. And that means literally dozens of different ideas and different cover designs until we plumped finally for the one bottom right down there. That's the one that we chose. And then the real work began. First, I had to work out the contents, the skeleton of the book, what to include. And first of all, in terms of non-species text, and that involves everything from whale conservation to whale parasites. And I think I found over the years whale watching, there's nothing more frustrating than having a great view of a whale and you can identify the whale and then seeing something weird attached to it and not knowing what it is. So we did cover most of the most familiar parasites that you see on whales, dolphins and porpoises. These are pseudo-stalked barnacles, Xenobalanus they're called, and they're sort of worm-like creatures. They're up to about 5 centimeters long, and I'm sure you've all seen them hanging from the trailing edges of the tails, the dorsal fins and the flippers of many different cetacean species. Then we have remora or suckerfish, which use that flat oval shaped suction disc on the top of the head to stick onto cetaceans and pretty much anything else, actually, anything in the sea, from manatees to submarines, even people occasionally. I had one following me when I was diving, never attached to me, but I was always looking over my shoulder and it was always there. I'm sure it wanted to. And then up there, there are some grey whale lice, which are not like insect lice, of course, but they're amphipod cetaceans, and they cling on to the grey whales, mainly on the heads, for dear life. I've always wanted to put a little microphone or a hydrophone, waterproof microphone, in amongst them all, and just listen to them, because they've got to hang on when the whale's breaching and diving and everything else. So you can imagine the whale breach and all these little whale lice clinging on for dear life because they fall off. They're done for. They can't survive swimming about in the open water. You can imagine them all going, ah, splash, and they cling on. And they're very good at doing it. To identify and to sort of work out what all these whale lice look like was actually really difficult, very time consuming. We worked out that there are 28 different species of whale lice that are known that live on different species of whales. And we had to go back to scientific papers over a century old to find references to be able to illustrate them all. Then we prepared ocean by ocean quick identification guides, quick ID guides. And that's, I think, really important when you're using a field guide. You need a way of speeding up the whole identification process to give you a quick idea at a glance of what it is you might be looking at. So, for example, here's a quick ID guide to all the species you could bump into in the South Atlantic Ocean. You have a quick look at that, you flick around and think, okay, it might be this or this or this, and then you know where to look. And you've narrowed it down to maybe 2, 3, 4 species already. Here's another quick ID guide showing all the species you might see bow riding in front of your boat to help with an at-a-glance identification of them all. And you wouldn't believe the time that we spent debating whether or not to show, whether or not to show the bow of the boat, what colour to make the boat, what colour to make the background, what order to show the whales, the dolphins and porpoises, and so on. Lots of toing and froing before we finally hit upon that final version. Here's another quick ID guide, this time comparing the size and shape and density of different whale blows or spouts. And this is, as you know, I'm sure, a fantastic way of identifying many of the larger species on a calm day. Even if they're miles away, even if you can't see the whales themselves, you can often identify them by their blows. And these particular blows are taken from several different spreads, just to give you an example. But again, you can't imagine the amount of time that went into researching them, because when you look at what people have written in the past, there's been a tendency to underestimate the height of blows. And I'm talking about blows on a good day. So after a deep dive, a very powerful blow on the first surfacing on a very calm day. And I think many of the estimates were underestimated by at least half, and sometimes more in some cases. And, it's a lot of research to look at video and our own research and field notes and thousands of photographs and great discussions to try and work out the exact shape, the height, and of course the density of the blows. And that varies a lot from species to species. And gradually piece it all together, you send it off to the different experts on those species, and gradually we get what we feel is the best, most accurate illustration of them. So let's do a little test for all of you at home, see if we can identify them. If you get all of them, I'll be very, very impressed. So going to start with the whale on the left. That is a sei whale. Then moving along the row, the next one is a Mura's whale. And then we have Antarctic minke whale. Now the next one's a bit easier. Hopefully you might get this one. Very distinctive blow. This is a bowhead whale. And then one of the easiest of all, certainly the tallest of all, of course, the blue whale. Now the other thing you had to do at the beginning of the whole project was to decide which species to include. Now I know that sounds ridiculous because, surely you include humpback whale, you've got killer whale, blue whale, bottlenose dolphin, and so on. Should be easy, but it was not. As I said before, the number of species and the naming of species and so on is in a constant state of flux. It's definitely not set in stone. So as more work's done in the field and more genetic studies are conducted in the lab, our understanding of what constitutes a distinct species really is, it's changing all the time. Species are being combined and split and so on, as I said at the beginning. And that doesn't even take into account the hundreds of subspecies and all the geographical variations that also have to be included in the guide. So I spent countless months, goodness knows how long, corresponding and talking with hundreds of experts, people who've spent their lives in many cases, just studying one species all over the world, working out what to include and what not to include. Now, the ultimate authority for this is the Society for Marine Mammalogy, SMM. And they publish a list typically about once a year of what all the experts have agreed are the species. But I wanted to try and predict what was likely to happen in the near future, so that the handbook wasn't going to be out of date, as soon as it went to press. You can just imagine it going off to the printer, too late to change anything, on the very day that SMM, Society for Marine Mammalogy, announces a newly accepted species. I'd be completely devastated if that happened. In fact, as we went to press with the handbook, the Society hadn't made a final decision about one particular whale. It looked like it was likely to be declared a brand new species, and I and many other people felt it should be. Its existence had been speculated for, well, it was more than 70 years or so. There were reported sightings by Japanese whalers for decades in the southern Sea of Okhotsk, just north of Japan, and we had 8 specimens. And based on all that evidence and what the experts were saying, I decided to include it as a separate species. And at the time, it made the 90th species of cetacean. I called it, because nobody really knew what it was going to be called, I called it the dwarf Baird's beaked whale. And in fact, a month after publication, a month after the handbook out, it was officially named. And the Latin name was, the scientific name was the same as I put Berardius minimus, and it was chosen to call it Sato's beaked whale. But at least the whale was in the book. And I've got to say, I don't know if you remember, just before Christmas, there was this very bizarre, I think quite outrageous claim, I won't say by whom, that they'd found a recent sighting, of some unidentified whales off the coast of Baja California in Mexico. They'd seen these whales, couldn't identify them, and they'd declared them a new species. All like that. It doesn't work like that. It's a very involved, complex process involving a lot of people, a lot of debate, a lot of research, a lot of analysis and comparison before you can safely say that there is a new species. So I worked with 3 absolutely brilliant artists on the book. The main one, Martin Cam, works here in the UK. and the gaps were filled by Rebecca Robinson, who's in Australia, and Tony Lobet, who's in Spain. And I spent countless hours talking with them, briefing them, sourcing reference photos and videos and field notes, discussing every little detail with them. And after a while, the exquisite artwork started arriving in the post. These are some of Martin's exquisite watercolours. They're just stunning, of a takushi and a Guyana dolphin. It was a great pleasure to open a jiffy bag and all this wonderful artwork, all original watercolours spilling out onto the desk. Got to be careful though. This is what it looks like when you spill an espresso on a takushi, and if you spill an Americano on a beautiful melon-headed whale. You've got to be really careful. Now, each piece of artwork, once we got it right, had to be scanned and then prepared for print. And every minute detail was checked. And with the artist's permission, of course, I made any minor corrections at this stage, any little adjustments in Photoshop. I think there were more than 1,000 pieces of artwork altogether. So here we've got Risso's dolphin, long-finned pilot whale, sperm whale, blue whale, that's a Longman's beaked whale, Amazon River dolphin or Boto. And down there in the bottom right hand corner, one of my favourites, I don't really have favourites, I love whatever whale or dolphin I'm looking at the time, but down in that right hand corner is the vaquita, or the Gulf of California porpoise. And it's a very sad story. This is the most critically endangered of the whole lot. It's possibly down to the last few 10 individuals or so. It's highly unlikely to survive very much longer, and it's all because it's being caught and drowned in illegal gill nets in the northern Sea of Cortez, or the Gulf of California, where it hangs on by a thread, literally, in its home on the Pacific coast of Mexico. And the fishermen there are fishing for totoaba, which is an endangered fish, and in the process they're catching the vaquita. And with fewer than 10 left, it's going to be very, very hard to protect them. So we've already lost the Yangtze River dolphin. That's likely to be the next species to go. But we weren't doing just one simple side image of each species. We were doing the upper side and the underside, male and female, juvenile and calf, subspecies, individual and geographical variations, any exceptional behaviour, and so on and so on. So here's some examples. Here we've got in the top left the upper side of the heads of various North Atlantic right whales. And they're showing the various callosities. So those are areas of thick, irregular, callous tissue that you find only on right whales. And the scientists are using them. They're all sort of in basically the same area, but they make different patterns. And the scientists are using those different patterns to tell one individual from another. Below that, we've got a few dorsal fin variations of Brooder's whales, and we've got beak variations in white-beaked dolphins. This is based on research in Iceland, actually. Got the upper side and underside of heavy-sized dolphins, grey and humpback whale tails, male and female hourglass dolphins. Look how different they look. Got a spinner dolphin spinning longitudinally as it does. I mean, that's a very distinctive identification feature. Got up there the northern hemisphere variations of the banding, that white banding on common minke whale flippers, and some of the southern right whale morphs or colour variants. I think there's one missing there, that the wild one as it's called, but all of those you can see very regularly. And all that, you can imagine, all the research for that really is quite involved. These are different killer whale or orca ecotypes. Now these particular ones are found in the Antarctic and adjacent waters. I should just say that weird yellowish brown one is the same as the one bottom left there. Both are large type B or pack ice killer whales, and that yellowy brown one's covered in diatoms. These are microscopic single-celled algae, and they cover their skin, especially after long stays in polar waters. So in the Antarctic, this film of diatoms that covers them takes about a month to develop. So its extent can actually be used to judge the amount of time that any particular killer whale has been in the Antarctic, in the region. So normally whales slough their skin and regenerate it, all the time. But the build-up of diatoms strongly suggests that this isn't happening, at least not happening as often in cold waters, probably to try and limit heat loss. And what we think happens, we're pretty sure happens, is killer whales in the Antarctic make like that yellowy, orangey brown one. It'll make a rapid migration into tropical waters, travelling thousands of miles, and then incidentally shed all those diatoms as it regenerates its skin tissue. And that sort of round trip typically takes anything from 5 to 7 weeks. And then the killer whale returns to the cold waters of the Antarctic looking much cleaner, like it's been through a car wash. And then it'll look like the one on the left there, bottom left, and it'll gradually get yellow and orange again before it makes another one of those tropical migrations. But we felt it was important to include and illustrate all these different variations, just like this, because otherwise, somebody's going to see a yellowy brown killer whale, and they might think they've discovered an entirely new species. So here they are all labelled. Yep, here we go. The term ecotype is very clever. So these are all different ecotypes, and it's used in killer whales. It's used for ecologically distinct forms or populations, ones that don't interbreed. Even if they inhabit the same waters, they might actually swim right past one another, and they don't interbreed. They have different seasonal distribution patterns. They've got different social structures, behavior, food, habitat preferences, vocal repertoires, and as you can see here, they're actually quite different in appearance too. So once you get your eye on, you can tell which ecotype of killer whale you're looking at. And by calling them ecotypes, I think it very neatly reflects the scientific uncertainty about killer whale taxonomy. So no one's rushed into, calling them all distinct species, although some may be recognised as distinct species at some point in the future. But here are 6, and this is out of about 40 recognised killer whale ecotypes. I think it's a brilliant way to handle the unknown without rushing to conclusions. So here's another example of a very important variation, and one that if you saw and didn't know anything about it, you might think you found a new species. This is a normal bowhead whale at the top and a molting bowhead whale underneath. Really quite a different looking animal. So meanwhile, what might appear to be simple diagrams, if you like these, also took countless hours to get right. So here we've got resting on, you can see just by looking at those, that's all you need, that little outline, and you can tell one species from another. Really important. We've got the dive sequence of a minke whale, and that's also, anyone who's been whale watching in Iceland will know it's very distinctive surfacing. So the pointed tip of its rostrum, of its snout, always breaks the surface, or I never say always, nearly always breaks the surface at an angle of something like 20 to 40 degrees. And then you've got the saddle patches, which are more or less saddle-shaped markings behind the dorsal fins of 3 other ecotypes of killer whale, these ones in the east and north Pacific, and you can identify them by the shape of those different saddle patch. So we spent countless hundreds of hours studying field notes and videos and photographs and so on to try and get these right, to help people to recognise the subtle differences between the species, and then to represent them accurately. Some of the artwork was not these beautiful original watercolours. Some of it was prepared as digital originals. So these are spade-toothed whales. You've got the male above there and the female below, and that's done in a style that, even though it's done on a computer, which I think is absolutely amazing, it's done in a style that I think sits perfectly well next to the watercolours. So you can't really, unless you're looking for it, you can't tell the difference. They all fit together in one book. We included a few photographs in the handbook version. The field guide is going to be all artwork, and of course used thousands of other photographs as reference, many of our own and other people's as well. So we got here the narwhal, that's the upper canine tooth, and that erupts when the animal's 2 or 3 years old, and it penetrates the upper lip and spirals out counterclockwise and grows continuously and makes its amazing tusk. I love all the theories we've had over the years for what a narwhal tusk might be used for, like drilling holes in ice, fighting, spearing fish. That's probably my favourite. Imagine, just think that through. So the narwhal spears a fish on the end of its tusk. It's got to have a really long tongue to get that fish off. I've seen video, somebody got some video not that long ago of them stunning fish. So they swipe the tusk from side to side. So it might be different reasons in different circumstances. Most likely, it's a secondary sexual characteristic, a bit like the antlers of a stag. I've already mentioned the Yangtze River dolphin. That was functionally extinct, is the official term, declared functionally extinct in 2007. It's the first cetacean, as far as we know, to become extinct in historical times. And as I said before, it won't be the last. That photo, I took that in there was single captive Yangtze River dolphin called Chi-Chi in a tank in Wuhan, now infamous Wuhan, with the virology lab. And it's one of very, very few photos ever taken of Yangtze River dolphins. So if I had one really precious photo, if the house was burning down, that's the one I'd want to rescue, because very few people have got pictures of them. And there is a harbour porpoise. That's my best picture of a harbour porpoise. I've been trying for years to get good pictures of them. And again, if you've been whale watching in Iceland, you know how difficult it is to get a good view of them. But I finally succeeded in getting that one a couple of years ago. That was in the Bay of Fundy in eastern Canada, where, I don't know, they seem to come out of the surface much higher than in other parts of the world. And they live in little groups as well, which is fantastic. And finally, there's the Amazon River dolphin. That one, I don't know if anyone's ever got another picture of a whale, dolphin or porpoise peeing, but this one turned upside down peeing out of the water. I love the fact the other one seems to be laughing at it. But I've got a theory about why they do it. I've no idea if this is true, and it would make a fantastic PhD project. So there's a thing in the Amazon called the kangaroo fish. And when you go there, if you're going to swim in the Amazon, you're warned not to pee, because otherwise the kangaroo fish swims up your willy, up the urine, and then up into your willy, has spines like an umbrella, so it goes doing like that, and it sticks inside your willy. And of course, that in the Amazon, well, anywhere, wherever you are, that would be a big problem. It's a huge problem in the Amazon. What they say is that you have to do this thing where you need a field guide, of course. You have to wander around the Amazon with the kangaroo fish stuck up your willy, and you have to find these particular plants using your field guide, and then you need to start a fire, and hopefully you've got a pot with you and some water. Boil the water, put the leaves of the plants in the water, and make a sort of tea. And this is all with the kangaroo fish stuck in your willy. And then you drink the tea, and 4 hours later, in theory, it dissolves. If it doesn't work, I don't know, maybe you have to just chop it all off. But anyway, my theory is that maybe Amazon River dolphins have the same problem. So they have to roll upside down and pee out of the water so they don't get a kangaroo fish swimming up. As I say, wonderful PhD project for somebody there. So distribution maps were another whole saga. Each distribution map, I have to say, I'm sorry, I do feel like I'm moaning now, but I'm just getting it all off my chest. So thank you for listening. It's like going to a psychiatrist. Each distribution map took days and days to put together. So this is my hand-drawn grey whale distribution map. As you can imagine how long that took. And here is the finished article ready for the book. And I did that for every species, and in many cases for different subspecies, or more detailed maps for different oceans. So for example, here's the spinner dolphin distribution map showing the ranges of the various subspecies, and there's also the hybrid, the white belly spinner there. So I decided right at the beginning of the guide not to refer to other books. It's a sure way of perpetuating mistakes. I think we all do it. If you get information from a book, if you're not careful, if you don't go back to the original source, that if there is a mistake, that just gets repeated again and again and again. So we went back to original scientific papers and put everything together piecemeal. And this is one of many scientific presentations I went to over the years. This is at a Society for Marine Mammalogy conference in San Francisco. And you get little snippets of information, get to meet interesting people who might help and so on at these conferences. And I think as a rough estimate, I actually read 11,000, 12,000 scientific papers altogether as part of my research. Then I wrote it all up, not just the distribution maps and the artworks, there's all the text as well. And I produced first drafts for each species, as we got here for the grey whale. So these then went out to many of the experts around the world who've been studying particular species. And as I said at the beginning, many of them studied them for years, or in some cases for entire lifetimes. And I was very lucky indeed that all the scientists I approached, some friends and colleagues, others I'd never met before, were incredibly generous with their time and their information. In fact, many emailed me months later, with new information and new discoveries, often things they hadn't even published themselves, that they were helping me to get into the book. So very, very generous indeed. This is actually it's a Perrin's beaked whale, very poorly known beaked whale, only known from Southern California. It's never been seen alive. At least there's never been an authenticated sighting of one alive, and it's only known from 6 dead and largely very decomposed stranded specimens, so we know very little about it. But it was named after an American cetologist called William Perrin in 2002, and it was actually William Perrin who advised and helped me with this particular species entry. Very kind of him. All these species experts then sent back their comments and suggestions on the text and the artwork and everything, and without exception, you know, they were really generous again with all their information, often giving me facts and figures that have never been published, and I'll always be very grateful for that. And there were lots of difficult decisions at this sort of semi-final stage, if you like, because of inevitable contradictions and opinions. You know, not everybody agrees on everything. So even down to, you know, what we're going to name certain species, what we're going to call them in the book. So this is the Peruvian beaked whale, or at least that's what I called it in the handbook. Some experts wanted me to call it the pygmy beaked whale because it's the smallest of all the beaked whales. But in the end, I decided to go with the man who discovered it in the first place, who is a friend of mine, Koen van Verenbeek, who lives in Peru. And so it's called the Peruvian beaked whale. But, you know, to try and please everyone, I put pygmy beaked whale as an alternative name. So incidentally, do you remember that unidentified beaked whale, Mesoplodon A, that I showed you right at the beginning, you know, from the original field guide 25 years ago? Well, it turned out to be this. This is it, the Peruvian or pygmy beaked whale, unidentified beaked whale. And, you know, the original illustration, actually, if you remember it, wasn't that bad. It did have that white sort of stripe across the center of the body in the male. So then we got it all together. The designer pulled all the text and the artwork and the diagrams and the photographs and the maps and everything together and started to produce the final complete book. And this went through, I think, it must have been 8 or 9 different versions before it was finally ready to go to print. So this is an example. This is the first spread of the blue whale. It looks like a nightmare. I mean, this wasn't too bad, this one, not too many corrections and updates. It was fairly typical, really. So I'd make all these corrections, and at this stage still updating information as it was coming in. That would go back to the designer, incorporate it all, come back again, get backwards and forwards, and gradually there were fewer and fewer corrections and updates, and the book, you know, started to take shape, and finally it was ready to go to print 5 years late. So now I'm just finishing the field guide. It's much shorter and more precise. The idea, of course, is to be used in the field. The handbook's a bit heavy for that. And amazingly, as I said at the beginning, quite a lot has changed. So a whole new species has been named. There's a small population of whales that belong to the so-called Brooders whale complex that's been known living in the Gulf of Mexico for quite a few decades, since I think about 1965. So we know they've been there, but we'd always thought they were Brooders whales. They've got the 3 ridges on the top of the head and so on. But recent research has revealed that these whales are genetically and morphologically distinct and geographically separated from that other Brooders whale population. So there's only about 30 of them, maybe a few more, but possibly as few as 30. And they do belong to a new species. And it was named earlier this year, in fact, and it's called Rice's whale. I've already said that South Asian river dolphin was split, and we're now back to 2 species. So that's different since the handbook, the Ganges river dolphin and the Indus river dolphin. And of course, there's that whale provisionally known as dwarf Baird's beaked whale, now known as Sato's beaked whale. And I'm sure there's going to be more. I mean, hopefully they won't announce another one on the day the field guide goes to press, but it's inevitable. This is what makes it so exciting, that it is in a constant state of flux. Well, I think I've pretty much run out of time now. So I guess the conclusion, the summary of the whole lecture, it's sort of life advice really, is quite simple as this. If a publisher ever sidles up to you and says, want to write a field guide? My advice is just say no.
So yeah, thank you so much for this great talk.
Thank you, great pleasure.
Yeah, we here in Húsavík are great fans of your book. And so I'm curious, do you think there are many species of whales we haven't discovered yet?
I know, it's exciting. It's a very exciting time to be, it's not just new species, but every time you go out on the water, there's a chance of seeing something that other people have never seen before, or foliage or something. And now with so many people out on the water every day, and it's not just whale researchers, it's whale watch operators and so on, are also adding to the research and the information. We're just discovering stuff so fast. It's with everything. I try to keep tabs on what's going on, but it's almost a job. It's a very, very exciting period.
Yeah, that's true. I think you mentioned that there are now 92 species of whales.
The latest count. Yes, so, and probably more. I mean, there's all sorts of discussion about whether one of the killer whales should be split, and instead of being called an ecotype, being called a species. I think maybe, and I'm not going to do this as the next one, I would guess it might be another one in the Brooders whale complex. And there are two types of Brooders whale. One's coastal and one's pelagic, lives offshore. And I think there's a good argument for splitting those into two separate species. That'll probably happen, as I said, on the day the field guide goes to print.
Yeah, becomes obsolete like as soon as it's published.
Yeah.
Almost. No, let's not hope not. Well, I have a question from Tom Grove. He wants to know how you dealt with conflicting information, like if sources provided different population estimates. How do you resolve that?
Yeah, that was really difficult, Tom, and that happened a lot, of course, because there's facts and there's analysing and working out what conclusions you make from the facts. And didn't agree, that's for sure. So in many cases, it was a matter of just toing and froing and working out a sort of happy medium that everybody was happy with. The biggest challenge is population numbers, and you mentioned that. And a lot of population estimates are guesstimates. They have to be. I always say to people, you can be on a whale watching trip in Scalfandi Bay or something, and you can say, I want you to count all the humpbacks or all the minkies that you see during the course of the trip. And you ask everyone on the boat for the number at the end of the trip. They'll all be completely different. And I know it's more scientific when you're doing surveys and so on, but then you get a feeling for what it might be like to work out how many minkies or how many humpbacks are in the whole of the North Atlantic. It is guesswork, and it depends how you use the results of techniques you use and that kind of thing. So in some cases, pretty much on population sizes. Sadly, that's mainly the smaller ones. Things like North Atlantic right whale. The population now so low. I think the latest figure I saw was 356. That every individual is known, and so give or take the odd one, everyone's agreeing on what the figure is. Other ones, it's more looking for trends. So if there was a lot of doubt about a population figure, I would say that, not give a figure, and say that the general trend seems to be upwards or downwards. So it's a matter of just trying to find a happy medium that everybody's happy with.
Yeah, of course, that's great. Another question from Rap. He says, "Hi Mark, and thank you for a great lecture. What is your next project that you're working on?"
Well, after the field guide, which is still ongoing, I can't really think of much more than that. I'm looking at doing another book on bird photography. And I'm making the most of being stuck in the UK like everybody else. Right now this week I should be in Wrangel Island in Russia, in the Russian Arctic, watching bowhead whales and polar bears. And then in a couple of weeks' time I should be in the Great Bear Rainforest and so on. So I've never been in one place for so long in my life. So I'm using the time to write books, basically. Instead of writing books on planes and trains and in the middle of the night, I'm enjoying writing books here. So I've got another couple of ideas for whale books. One of my great passions is Baja California in Mexico, where I mentioned the vaquita lives. and I've been going there every winter for 25 years. I can't believe it. And over the years, I've collected quite a big, collection of photographs. So I'm in the middle of putting together a photographic book about Baja, trying to raise some money for conservation work on whales in Baja. So that's a nice book because there's not too much writing. So it's looking at photos and little captions and so on, instead of staying through the night writing hundreds of thousands of words. And good chance to do a lot of conservation work. I feel so passionately about conservation. I think everyone who loves wildlife should put something back. So I'm doing a lot of voluntary work, raising funds and awareness for various favourite charities and that kind of thing. So yeah, all sorts of interesting, nice projects.
Yeah. Since you mentioned conservation, I would love to know if you, what matter do you believe is the most urgent in relation to whale welfare or whale conservation?
Oh my goodness, how long have we got? I could rant about this forever. As everybody watching knows, I'm sure whales, dolphins and porpoises face so many different threats. It's amazing there's any left sometimes. I literally lie awake at night worrying because there's so much that they're facing. The obvious stuff. There's still commercial whaling, which is hard to believe. There's a lot of other hunting of smaller species. I think there are massive conflicts with fisheries. So not just, one of the main ones is being captured in fishing nets, entangled in fishing nets and drowning, which is probably the most obvious and immediate threat. We're talking hundreds of thousands of them getting drowned in fishing nets every year. And then you've got the conflict with fisheries with overfishing. So, we're hoovering up fish stocks. It's a massive, massive industry worldwide. And if we're hoovering up fish stocks, there's less for the whales and dolphins and porpoises and all the other wildlife to feed on. And many fish stocks are severely overfished. So that's another major threat. Pollution is another one, all sorts of pollution. Most marine pollution actually comes from the land. It's actually something we could manage. Everything from industrial effluent to agricultural runoff and raw sewage and all that kind of thing. Habitat degradation and disturbance is another threat. Underwater noise. Just the amount of noise in oceans is quite scary and phenomenal. And when you think they live by sound, it's like us living in a permanent loud disco and trying to function. I'm going deaf as I get older anyway. I find it hard enough in a loud room, and with all the noise from shipping and drilling and everything else, they find it really difficult. But if I had to pick one threat that really, really scares me, it's climate change, and that scares me generally. I think one of the big challenges with climate change is that there's a long gap between what we, and so even scientists, people in the conservation field are finding it hard to make that link between what we're doing and what's happening. And it's only, conservationists have been talking about climate change and warning about it for 50 years, but it's only now we're seeing some of the consequences with flooding and these excessive temperatures and all the rest of it. People are, and I'm not saying politicians, they're always way behind the rest of us. Whoa, this is really happening. And from a cetacean point of view, it has many, many impacts, many different threats. So, we don't really use directly, but you're obviously going to get increased sea temperatures. You'll get a retreat of sea ice and less sea ice during the season, rise in sea levels, you get higher various changes in upwellings and ocean processes and that kind of thing. And that's inevitably going to lead to less productivity and less biodiversity. And the impact on cetaceans is, it'll affect their migrations and their local movements, their breeding seasons, their feeding ranges, their seasonal cycles. It'll influence what they have to eat, competition for their food, reproductive successes, susceptibility to disease. There are so many possible things. And then also, not on top of all that, with melting ice in the Arctic in particular, that's opening up the Arctic to industrialization, to more fishing, to more shipping. And then you get subtle changes like whales are now able to move between, for example, the North Pacific, because the North Northwest Passage is open. Same with the Northeast Passage. So there'll be all those subtle changes as well. So it's something, you could talk about for hours, but there are all those threats. But if I had to pick one that really scares me, and this is saying something when you think of things like fishing, I would say it's climate change.
Yeah.
Sorry,
all of these topics you mentioned. Yeah. I mean, all of these topics you mentioned, they're so big, and I don't know. We're also just getting like more people on the planet every day. So it seems like the problem and the need for everything that we consume will just increase.
I know everything is harder. The more people you have, two ways about it. That's the big elephant in the room. But I think what scares me is, a lot of us, and I'm sure most people watching get it and understand how serious the challenges are. But even in the UK, we're one of the most nature depleted countries in the world. We rank 228th out of 240 countries and territories that have been assessed, and we should know better. We've got the money to do better. We should know better, and we have no excuse not to be saving our wildlife. So if we can't do it, it makes you wonder how anyone in the world is doing it, and it's really quite scary.
Yeah, I couldn't agree more. I think we have to take like dramatic action. Like, should have done it decades ago, but
well, we do. I mean, on that point, I actually sorry to interrupt. I feel that the days when we as individuals can solve these problems have really gone. I'm not saying we should stop, not by any means. We need to do everything we can, but we're at a stage now in conservation where we need decisions made at government level. We need the world's governments' decisions changing the way we operate, we live our lives, the way the economics works and everything else. And it needs to be at that level and big industry level, big business. It's an awful thing to say, but traditional conservation has not worked. It's not failed because it stopped a lot of things getting worse, and everything would be much worse without conservation. But we're at that point where we really need to have dramatic changes and big impact from government level.
Yeah, I couldn't agree more. So we have another question from Van Rempel. He says, "Hi Mark, thank you so much for doing this. I'm a big fan. What advice would you give to someone writing a book about the history of Iceland's relationship with whales?"
Wow, what a fantastic book to write. That's great. It's a really good book to do and much needed. Wow, what advice to give? Well, what I generally do with starting a new book is I spend quite a lot of time just thinking about it subconsciously. I never sit down and start writing with a blank piece of paper and not know where to start. So I spend a lot of time thinking about it, talking to people who know about the subject, building up a feel for the style the book might need, what should be included and that kind of thing. Then you obviously start by drawing your content, so you know what you're going to do, and you sort of take it step by step. So instead of thinking, oh, I've got to write 70,000 words and there's the blank page, you start with chapter 1 and you start there. And I find the best thing is just to read a lot and absorb a lot of everything from articles, scientific papers, things on YouTube you can watch, and just swamp yourself in the subject, just completely get absorbed in it, and then start writing. And then you'll subconsciously be working out your own views on it and how you might present it. And then as you get to the nitty gritty, you can do very specific research and go to specific scientific papers and historical. I would recommend, as I did, getting other people, and there are a lot of fantastic people in Iceland who've been very involved in the whaling industry and the whale watching industry and whale conservation and everything else, and get their thoughts on it and get their feedback. And you don't have to take it all on board, but it's very useful to get other people's points of view, and it might spark a few great ideas and so on. So it's a really great book to be writing. I can't wait. When's that going to be published? I can't wait to see that one.
Yeah, me too. So yeah, I think that's all of the questions we have.
Okay.
So
Can I just
want to say
can I
big
ask
thank
you a question?
Of course.
I've heard a rumor that you're trying to establish a marine protected area in Scalfandi Bay. Right, where you
That's true. That's true. Are currently working towards turning the bay into a marine protected area. I would like to refer people interested to an organization called Ocean Missions. They are in relation with Mission Blue, which is a great, very, very distinguished establishment. And we are currently looking for anybody that can help us to achieve this goal. We want to, of course, turn at least 30% of the oceans into marine protected areas. It should be much more, maybe at least 50. So that's
it's about 3-4% at the moment, and many of those protected areas are just lines on a map. They're not really protected at all. So I think it only really counts if you're at the very least managing fishing and limiting fishing in the zone, hopefully banning it altogether, and having proper protection, not just saying it's a protected area and then calling that a day.
Yeah, that's true.
Well, that's great.
Yeah, we're really excited for it. So, thank you so much for tonight.
Thank you very much.
It was great having you. It was great having you with us, and we're so thankful for your time. And I want to thank everybody at home watching and here in the museum with us. And we'll see you again for the next event of the Whale Congress tomorrow night at 7:30. Thank you.